They never saw the J-35 until it was too late. In the Cold War skies, Soviet bombers thought they owned the Baltic. Their radars showed nothing. Their escorts saw only empty clouds, and then out of nowhere a shadow slid into formation beside them, sleek, silent, and already armed. It wasn't American, it wasn't NATO, it was something they had never expected. Sweden's J-35 Draken, the jet they never saw until it was too late. The dragon in the shadows. The Cold War was a contest of giants. The United States and the Soviet Union poured billions into their air forces, racing to dominate the skies with ever faster, ever deadlier fighter jets and bombers. American Phantoms, Soviet MiGs, and British Lightnings were plastered across military journals, each hailed as symbols of progress and deterrence. From Berlin to Korea, from Cuba to Vietnam, these aircraft clashed directly or stared each other down in tense standoffs that shaped global politics. But not every Cold War battle was fought by superpowers. In the high north of Europe, just beyond the reach of NATO and perilously close to Soviet territory, a smaller nation faced its own survival dilemma. Sweden, officially neutral, was geographically wedged between East and West. Neutrality sounded safe in speeches, but the map told a harsher story. If war erupted, Sweden would be a frontline state. Its skies would become corridors for bombers, its airfields targets for missiles. Its neutrality shattered in the opening hours of World War III. For Sweden, the choice was simple: defend itself with innovation, or be erased. Unlike NATO countries, Sweden could not rely on American guarantees. Unlike Warsaw Pact nations, it was not shielded by the Soviet military machine. Sweden had to stand alone. Its population was small, its economy modest compared to the superpowers, but its engineers and military planners were ambitious. If they couldn't build the biggest air force, they would build one designed to survive when others fell. The solution took shape in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when Swedish strategists asked themselves an audacious question: what if we could leap ahead of the curve? What if Sweden could design a fighter so advanced, so versatile that it could hold its own against the best Soviet or NATO jets? What if through sheer brilliance in engineering and doctrine, a small neutral nation could deter superpowers? The answer was the Saab J-35 Draken. The Draken, Swedish for dragon, was unlike anything the world had seen. At first glance it looked futuristic, a blade with wings, sharp and elegant, its double delta wing forming a perfect geometric silhouette. It wasn't just style. That radical wing gave the Draken unprecedented agility, letting it turn tighter than most of its contemporaries without stalling. It gave the jet blistering climb performance, the ability to leap into the sky faster than many American or Soviet fighters. And crucially, it gave Sweden a tool of survival, a plane that could launch quickly, intercept intruders, and disappear just as suddenly. Yet the Draken's true strength wasn't only in its design, it was in the system Sweden built around it. Knowing Soviet bombers would target airbases first, Sweden created a doctrine of dispersed operations. Fighters were hidden along highways, fueled by trucks, maintained in forests. Pilots who flew against it in exercises recalled the same unnerving experience. One moment, the radar looked clear. The next, a Draken was on their wingtip or cutting across their nose, having appeared from nowhere. It wasn't stealthy by radar signature. It was stealthy in practice, hidden by doctrine, surprise, and sheer speed. The Cold War produced many icons, but the J-35 Draken was different. It was not built for prestige or export dominance. It was built for survival. Sweden's survival, and in that mission it became a silent legend. For those who faced it, one truth remained: they never saw it coming, until it was too late. Sweden's dilemma, alone between superpowers. Sweden's geography has always been both a blessing and a curse. On the map it looks like a quiet Scandinavian kingdom tucked away in the north, but during the Cold War, that map turned Sweden into one of the most strategically vulnerable nations on Earth. To the west lay Norway, a NATO member with American bases and radar stations. To the east lay the Soviet Union and its massive military machine, with bomber routes that passed directly over the Baltic Sea and fighter regiments stationed just minutes from Swedish territory. Sweden's long coastline, sparsely populated forests, and proximity to the Arctic routes made it impossible to ignore. Officially, Sweden was neutral. Its politicians spoke of staying out of conflicts, of being a peaceful bridge between East and West, but the Swedish military knew better. Neutrality meant nothing if you couldn't defend it. If World War III erupted, Sweden would almost certainly be in the line of fire. Soviet bombers heading for NATO targets in Western Europe would cross Swedish skies. NATO aircraft responding could cut through Sweden too. Either side might decide to seize Swedish territory to gain an advantage. That terrifying reality forced Swedish planners to make hard choices. Unlike NATO nations, Sweden could not rely on American nuclear umbrellas or bases filled with Allied jets. Unlike Warsaw Pact states, it did not have Soviet divisions ready to defend it. Sweden stood alone. Its population was small, its economy modest compared to the superpowers. But there was one advantage. Sweden's defense industry was fiercely independent. Saab, the nation's leading aerospace firm, had already built capable fighters in the 1940s and 50s. Swedish engineers weren't afraid of radical designs, and unlike politicians in Washington or Moscow, Swedish leaders listened closely to their military. They understood, if Sweden was to survive, it needed not just numbers, but innovation. The problem was brutal in its simplicity. If the Soviets launched a first strike, Sweden's airfields would be among the first targets. A few ballistic missiles or bomber raids could wipe out the Swedish Air Force on the ground before it ever got airborne. To survive, Sweden's fighters had to be fast enough to scramble in minutes, dispersed enough to avoid destruction, and lethal enough to stand toe-to-toe with Soviet MiGs and intercept bombers before they reached their targets. In other words, Sweden needed a miracle, a jet that could fight out of proportion to its size, that could operate without the crutches of giant bases or foreign allies. It would have to be, in every sense, a survivor. That miracle would come in the form of the Saab J-35 Draken. Birth of the Dragon, a radical idea. The story of the J-35 begins not in the skies, but in a drawing room at Saab in the late 1940s. Swedish engineers had been given a daunting requirement: design a fighter that could fly at supersonic speeds, intercept bombers at high altitude, and still be nimble enough to dogfight MiGs if needed. At that time, no one had solved this puzzle. Early jets could go supersonic, but they often became unstable and dangerous at high speeds. Most high-speed fighters sacrificed low-speed handling, making them vulnerable during takeoff, landing, or turning fights. Sweden needed both. Enter the double delta wing. Saab's lead engineer, Eric Bratt, proposed a wing shape unlike anything else in the world. It combined a sharp inner delta, optimized for high-speed flight, with a broader outer delta that provided lift and stability at lower speeds. On paper it looked strange, almost futuristic, but in the wind tunnel it performed miracles. The design promised blistering supersonic performance while still letting the jet handle gracefully at slower speeds. The first prototype flew in 1955. From the moment it took off, it was clear this was no ordinary aircraft. The Draken leapt into the sky like a rocket, climbing faster than many Western jets of the day. It reached Mach 2 in testing, making it one of the first European fighters to break that barrier, and most importantly, it could turn and keep turning without falling into deadly stalls. The engineers didn't stop there. They tested the Draken at extreme angles of attack, deliberately pushing it into stalls to learn how it behaved. These experiments led to maneuvers no other jet had attempted, controlled superstalls that decades later would inspire tricks like the Cobra maneuver in the 1950s. This was science fiction, but the Draken was not science fiction. It was steel, fuel, and fire, and it was ready to defend Sweden. The invisible predator, dispersed tactics. The Draken's design was only half the story. The other half was how Sweden intended to use it. The Swedish Air Force knew it could not protect its jets by parking them in neat rows on large air bases. Those bases would be cratered in the opening minutes of war. So, they created Bus 60, a doctrine of dispersed operations. Instead of concentrating fighters at a few major bases, Sweden prepared hundreds of small roadways, highways, and forest clearings to act as hidden runways. Drakens could land on a 500-meter stretch of highway, roll to the side, and be refueled by trucks hidden under camouflage nets. Ground crews could rearm the jet in minutes. Then, with a deafening roar, the Draken could leap back into the sky, often before the enemy even realized where it had gone. This doctrine made the Draken effectively invisible. NATO and Warsaw Pact planners could map Sweden's known airbases, but they could not predict the hundreds of secret road bases scattered through the forests. Even if the Soviets destroyed 10 bases, dozens more would remain. Drakens would keep flying, keep striking, keep appearing in places no one expected. For Soviet pilots, this was unnerving. Radar sweeps over Sweden might look clear, only for a Draken to suddenly appear on their flank. NATO pilots in exercises had the same experience. One moment, empty sky; the next, the silhouette of a double delta wing filling their canopy. The Draken wasn't stealthy in radar cross-section, but it was stealthy in effect. The red tide encounters with the Soviets. The Cold War was a chess match, and the Baltic Sea was one of its busiest boards. Soviet bombers flew regular missions along Sweden's borders, testing defenses, mapping radar coverage, and probing for weaknesses. Tu-16 Badgers, Tu-95 Bears, and MiG-21 escorts often swept dangerously close to Swedish airspace. And time after time, the Draken was there. Swedish interceptors scrambled with astonishing speed. Hidden in forest bases, Drakens would roar skyward, guided by ground radar stations. Within minutes, they were on intercept courses. Soviet bomber crews often reported the same unsettling moment. Their instruments showed nothing, and then suddenly, a Swedish fighter slid into formation alongside them, weapons armed, pilot helmet gleaming in the cockpit. The message was clear: you are seen, you are not welcome. Some encounters turned tense. Soviet fighters occasionally tried to push the Drakens aside, maneuvering aggressively, but the Swedes rarely backed down. More than once, a MiG pilot who thought he could outturn the Draken found himself outmaneuvered instead. The double delta wing proved its worth in real confrontations, not just exercises. For the Soviets, this was frustrating. Sweden was not a NATO member. Officially it was neutral. Yet its defenses were strong enough to block bomber corridors and challenge Soviet air power. For Moscow, it was a reminder that the small Scandinavian kingdom could not be ignored. Outrunning the intercept. For the Soviets, this was frustrating. Sweden was not a NATO member. Officially it was neutral. Yet its defenses were strong enough to block bomber corridors and challenge Soviet air power. For Moscow, it was a reminder that the small Scandinavian kingdom could not be ignored. NATO pilots saw this firsthand in joint exercises. American F-104 starfighters, known for their speed, tried to challenge the Draken, but the F-104 was notoriously poor in tight turns, while the Draken thrived there. In mock dogfights, Swedish pilots consistently turned inside the starfighters, forcing them into kills. French Mirage IIs and even early British Lightnings had similar experiences. The Draken was not unbeatable. No jet is, but it was unpredictable. It could fight at altitudes and angles others avoided. It could vanish from radar by skimming low across the Baltic, then climb suddenly into the stratosphere. It could intercept a bomber at Mach 2, then slow to land on a forest road. It was a fighter that broke the rules and in doing so, rewrote them. The day they never saw it. One particular incident became legend in the Swedish Air Force. It was the late 1960s, and a formation of Soviet bombers, escorted by MiGs, swept close to Swedish territory on what Moscow called a training mission. Confident in their numbers, the Soviets assumed Sweden would hesitate, but the Drakens were waiting. Launched from hidden highway bases, 2 flights of J-35s scrambled within minutes. Climbing low beneath radar coverage, they streaked toward the bombers undetected. By the time Soviet radar picked them up, the Drakens were already in firing position. Swedish pilots slid alongside the bomber formation, weapons armed, silently signaling, "Turn back." The MiG escorts scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The Drakens had made their point. They could appear where no one expected, faster than anyone thought possible. The Soviets backed off, the bombers turning back toward Kaliningrad. Official reports were vague. No shots were fired. But among pilots, the story spread quickly. The day Sweden's Dragons showed their teeth, and the Soviets realized they could not fly unchallenged. Lessons for NATO. The Draken wasn't just a problem for the Soviets. It was a surprise for NATO too. During exercises in the 1960s and 70s, American, British, and French pilots expected to dominate their Swedish counterparts. After all, NATO flew the most advanced jets money could buy. But time and again they were humbled. USF or Phantom pilots found the Draken hard to pin down in close combat. Mirage pilots discovered the Swedes could exploit angles of attack the French jets couldn't sustain. Even the vaunted British Lightning, one of the fastest interceptors of its day, struggled to shake a determined Draken. What impressed NATO most wasn't just the jet, it was the system. The Swedes didn't rely on giant bases or complicated logistics. They operated from highways, kept their turnaround times short, and launched fighters faster than many NATO units. In some ways, Sweden was ahead of both superpowers, showing how a small nation could fight smart rather than just fighting big. For NATO, the Draken was a reminder that quality and doctrine could outweigh numbers. For Sweden, it was validation. They had built not just a jet, but a credible shield against both East and West. The legacy of the Dragon. By the 1980s, the Draken was gradually replaced by the Saab Vegan, but its impact lingered. It had proven that a small, neutral nation could design a world-class fighter. It had pioneered tactics of dispersed basing that NATO later studied and even adopted, and it had provided data on extreme flight conditions that influenced generations of aircraft testing worldwide. More importantly, it gave Sweden confidence. With the Draken in its arsenal, Sweden was not a passive neutral state hoping to be ignored. It was an active defender, ready to protect its skies and deny access to anyone who dared trespass. The Draken flew with distinction not just in Sweden, but in Austria, Finland, and Denmark. It became a symbol of Scandinavian resilience, sleek, sharp, and always underestimated. Epilogue, forgotten but never truly gone. The Saab J-35 Draken is not often the first jet that comes to mind when people talk about Cold War legends. Ask the average aviation enthusiast to name iconic fighters of the era, and you'll hear about the F-4 Phantom thundering across Vietnam, the MiG-21 darting through the skies of the Middle East, or the English Electric Lightning racing to intercept Soviet bombers over the North Sea. The Draken rarely makes that list, and yet, for those who flew it, for those who trained against it, and for those who tracked it nervously from radar rooms in Moscow, the Draken was unforgettable. Forgotten in the public imagination perhaps, but never truly gone. The passing of an era. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the world of fighter aviation had moved on. The American F-15 Eagle redefined air superiority with unmatched power and radar reach. The Soviet Union countered with the Su-27 flanker, a monster of a fighter with range and agility. The age of the teen series fighters, the F-15, F-16, F-18 was beginning. Compared to these machines, the J-35 looked older, a relic of a different time. And yet, when Drakens squared off against these newer jets in exercises, the old Dragon often held its own. Pilots of the F-16 and Mirage 2000 admitted, privately, that the J-35's turning ability, especially at low speeds, could trap the unwary. Its ability to appear suddenly, thanks to Sweden's doctrine of dispersed basing, meant it remained a credible defender even into its later years. But Draken wasn't obsolete, it was simply overshadowed by louder, bigger stories, from Sweden to the world. The Draken's wings stretched beyond Sweden. Finland, Denmark, and Austria all adopted the aircraft, finding in it a cost-effective yet formidable tool for their own defense. In Austrian service, the Draken became something of a cult icon, sleek, elegant, and respected by NATO pilots who trained alongside it. These exports extended the Draken's lifespan well into the 1990s. Even as stealth fighters like the F-117 were making headlines, Drakens were still flying combat air patrols, still scrambling to intercept intruders. In some cases, they were maintained almost like classic sports cars, lovingly cared for, flown by pilots who understood they were commanding a piece of history. And long after retirement, a handful of Drakens remain in private hands, flown at Eshdos. When one streaks across the sky today, that dagger-shaped silhouette still turns heads. Even among modern stealth jets, the double delta wing looks futuristic, a reminder of the boldness of 1950s engineering, legacy in metal and doctrine. The Draken's influence did not vanish with its retirement. Saab's next creation, the Vegan, borrowed heavily from lessons learned in the Draken program. Dispersed basing, short runway takeoffs, and rugged survivability remained at the heart of Sweden's air defense philosophy, and the ultimate successor, the Saab Gripen, carries that philosophy into the 21st century. Small, smart, affordable, and lethal. In this way, the Draken is still alive. Every Gripen that launches from a stretch of Swedish highway carries with it the DNA of the J-35. Every exercise where a Gripen surprises a more expensive rival echoes those Cold War stories of NATO pilots humbled by the Dragon. The Draken also left behind a subtler legacy. Data was one of the first jets extensively tested at extreme angles of attack, pushing into stall regions deliberately to learn how to recover. Those tests informed not just Swedish aviation, but international understanding of flight control, paving the way for modern fighters to execute maneuvers like the Cobra and post-stall turns. The memory of the pilots, more than the technology, though the Draken's true immortality lives in the memories of the men who flew it. Ask a Swedish pilot of the 1960s what it was like to sit in the cockpit of a Draken and their eyes light up. They talk about the rush of the climb, the way the jet seemed to leap skyward like a rocket. They remember the satisfaction of sliding unseen beneath a Soviet bomber, popping up on its flank with weapons armed. They remember the respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes admiring, from NATO pilots who suddenly realized the neutral Swedes had a world-class fighter. And they remember the feeling of security. For all its danger and adrenaline, the Draken was built for one reason: to protect Sweden, to give a small nation the means to say to any invader, "You will not have an easy fight." In that mission, the Draken succeeded, forgotten by the world, remembered by history. Today, younger generations scroll past the Draken in photos, mistaking it for just another Cold War delta wing. But history whispers a different truth. The J-35 was never meant to be a global celebrity. It was meant to be a shield in the shadows, a dragon that struck only when provoked. It was invisible before stealth, not because it evaded radar in the modern sense, but because it existed outside the expectations of the great powers. The Soviets did not expect Sweden to field such a jet. NATO did not expect a neutral state to hold such a trump card. The world never truly expected the Draken until they met it. The Dragon's shadow. As the Cold War faded and the world entered a new era of asymmetric conflicts and stealth technology, the Draken quietly retired, but the lessons it left behind are still felt. Survival is not always about being the strongest or the biggest. Sometimes it is about being cleverer, faster, and more unpredictable. In the end, the Draken was not a weapon of conquest. It was a weapon of deterrence, a reminder that even small nations could breathe fire if cornered. Forgotten by many, overshadowed by louder names, the J-35 Draken remains in the shadows of history, but it is never truly gone. For those who saw it streak across the sky, for those who trained against it and came away humbled, and for those who slept safer beneath its watchful presence, the memory is eternal. The Dragon may no longer fly in combat, but its shadow still lingers, a warning, a legend, a promise. They never saw it coming then, and in history's memory, they never will.